Good evening, Western Standard viewers. I'm Nigel Hannaford, and welcome to the Hannaford Show. With me today is David Leis. David is a vice president at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. They're based out of Winnipeg. Long-time organization doing quality research on issues relating to government and public policy. In Western liberal democracies, we are so anxious to make sure that minorities are not victimized by majorities, that we have human rights commissions so that there is a place of redress for those who feel they've been unfairly discriminated against. So you would think that respect and fair treatment for everybody went both ways, but maybe it doesn't. Canada's Liberal government is a desperate attempt to distract Canadians from their disastrous ministry of setting up funds to encourage Canadians to snitch on their neighbors. David, I know you have some thoughts on this. Welcome to the program.
It's great to see you, Nigel.
It's good to have you here. David, a year before the election, they've just put up $273 million as a fund for people who can complain about their neighbors if they think they're haters. I didn't think that there were that many haters left in Canada. There may have been once, but we seem to be a pretty fair-minded group of people these days. Are there cross burnings in Winnipeg?
You know, not that I'm aware of. I do know that there are hate-filled acts going on in this country, but I dare to say not in the same way that this government wants to portray and announce the issues of hate across this country. So it's a very dark day for our country, quite frankly, as they set up what I believe is a mechanism, a tool, even a weapon to basically hold up a particular narrative of hate. I would say really through kind of a Marxist lens, where it's about identity politics. It's about identifying groups that are part of your constituency and mobilizing them so that they can actually fine, penalize, and put in jail those that disagree with them.
Now, okay, can you give me some examples of the kind of people who are actually receiving this money and what they do with it?
Well, I think you have to look at the whole spectrum here, but you basically have a variety of groups that they are generously funding by the taxpayer to basically create a coalition combined with other acts such as the so-called Online Harms Act, Bill C-63. These are all very powerful ways to basically assault not only the rule of law, but freedom of speech. And they're funding it through a number of groups, one of which is, of course, the Anti-Race Foundation, the Race Relations Foundation of Canada. They're bringing that together with two other interesting bodies, and that would be police forces, particularly the RCMP, as well as Stats Canada, as they, of course, redefine what hate means in this country to ones where people feel victimized or somehow feel offended. So I think these are huge red flags. As this story unfolds, this is a dark day for this country as we look at how this government is funding and facilitating, in my humble opinion, a policy initiative that's really about upholding their narrative and systematically narrowing down the sense of freedom of speech and, of course, changing the rule and application of law.
So who are the people? Like, can you name the kinds of people who are actually running afoul of this new legislation and the grants that support these little self-appointed militia groups? I guess militia is not a particularly good word, but little groups. We can find the haters for you. Just give us the money, and they put in their application to Heritage Canada, and they get $150,000 and start or more. And start producing reports. So who are they reporting on? I don't know that there are that many Aryan nations compounds left to go report on.
Well, it's a very good question, Nigel. I think what you have is kind of the usual suspects in the sense that you have a coalition of groups that do uphold the narrative that our country, Canada, is a hopelessly systematically racist nation, that we need to identify people on their tribe based on their skin color or their sexual orientation. And what is interesting is that they seem to be going about this in phases. So they're identifying a variety of partners that, or sorry, pardon me, they're identifying a variety of parties that offend their sensibilities around key narratives. So, for example, you have the so-called residential school denialists. You have parties that dare to disagree that somehow residential schools were not simply akin to Nazi death camps, and there were a myriad of mass graves. And as we know, that there has not been evidence to suggest that there are mass graves. And so I think you have something more profound going on as well. You have an effort really to take on anyone that would question this so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion narrative. And that as you know, is very much based on a Marxist cultural ideology, where there's a endless drumbeat of oppressor versus the oppressed. And in this case, anyone who would dare question that narrative then is going to be positioned to be able to be sought after, complained about, through a very interesting process. It's probably my sense is that they're not going to be going after people through the regular court system, but rather through human rights tribunals. And of course, we know that the application of the law then is not the same as our larger court system. So it's really been it's a kind of a typical playbook that we see through human history of totalitarian regimes demonizing their ideological opponents, separating them out, and then eventually persecuting them in the form of legal action or public humiliation, and basically weaponizing the law against your ideological opponent.
Yeah, but David, what you're describing is the kind of thing that happened in the French Revolution or in the Russian Revolution or in Nazi Germany. Surely you're not proposing that the government of Canada is using the same kind of techniques as these very admittedly authoritarian and cruel regimes?
Well, quite frankly, I am. I believe that from a policy historical point of view, it's the same playbook to basically demonize and villainize a party. So when they talk about an anti-hate initiative, the irony is that this is not about anti-hate. It's actually about creating hate and resentment towards those who are truth seekers, who one of the incredible strengths of our country and our Anglo-Saxon tradition is one of truth seeking. Now, we're not the only parties in the world that have that tradition, but we're one of the few. And this ability to find truth is an extraordinary strength. And in order to do that, we need freedom of speech. We need to be able to have vigorous discussions and debates about what really is the evidence regarding an issue. But in that spirit, though, these people are totally foreign to that assumption. And I think if they were not, they would actually be emphasizing in this recent announcement, a so-called anti-hate initiative, great care and attention to the importance of facts and evidence and rule of law and healthy discussion. They seek to undermine healthy discussion that has allowed us to be a successful, free, and democratic society.
Now, we talk about hate, and we have, I think most people, when they hear the word hate, have a certain image in mind. I mean, I've referred to Aryan nations, cross burnings, and things like that. I actually went onto the website of one of these organizations that's received more than $600,000 in federal funding to report on hate in their community. And I found that one of the things they were concerned about was the recent American film, Am I a Racist?, had been playing in theaters near them. They thought that was hateful. They also drew to attention that there was a nice young couple who were concerned about educational policy, and especially as regards to what was taught in the classroom about trans ideology to quite young children, and they were running for school board, and in order to have their say on that in an appropriate forum, and they were labeled as haters. So, on the other hand, I have seen nothing about the hate of, for example, a Jewish community in Toronto being swarmed by a hostile pro-Gaza, anti-Israel crowd. So how do where is the hate, and what is the distinction when it comes to funding these groups? Does anybody care about what obviously is truly hateful?
That's the irony, Nigel, is what you see is an effort to define hate on their terms that clearly supports their narrative. So if you see acts of anti-Semitism, most likely they will turn a blind eye to that because it does not fit within their narrative, their political coalition, if you will. So what you have is the irony that you have time and time again all kinds of examples of hate. Let's take, for instance, as well, Nigel, the burning of some 100 Christian churches right across this country. And in almost all cases, we still do not have a sense of how the perpetrators are being prosecuted or investigated. You have a kind of a double standard of the application of the law. And so this is, again, begs worrisome questions about how this type of initiative will actually be used to just simply go after parties that do fit their narrative, based on reality or not. But it's a way to weaponize the rule of law against their political opponents. So on one hand, this is driven by ideology, I would argue, but it's also driven by cynical application of identity politics.
Has any government of Canada ever actively gone after a section of its own population in order to divert attention from other things that they may be doing that wouldn't be so popular?
I can think of many examples, as you full well know, Nigel, where governments have sought to change the channel to kind of draw attention to something that is not working. But not in this regard. I think this is a very concerning development in our society. Canadians are drawn together in unity based on the principle that we are citizens of this great country, not because of the color of our skin or our sexual orientation, but because of our shared commitment to principles that allow for the rights and freedoms of individuals and our constitutional tradition. And so this is a great deviation from that. I mean, this is a very disturbing, dark day for our country when we make announcements and fund hundreds of millions of dollars towards this entirely alien tradition of the rule of law and freedom of speech.
I don't want to belabor the point because I think you've made it very well several times already, but we really are looking at something new, that this is not the Liberal Party that we used to know. I mean, many of us had our differences with the Liberal Party as it operated under Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien and back to Pierre Trudeau. But this kind of assault on free speech that you are describing, in which the government funds are actually given to people to be snitches, to actually go out and to find what they think is hateful, and of course to then discover that what they think is hateful is, to most people, probably a reasonable discussion on a point of principle, and not actually hate at all in the conventional system. And yet, when you do find real hate going on, and we're using the example of the invasion of Jewish neighborhoods in Toronto by hostile crowds. Good Lord! I mean, if that was a group of skinheads invading the same neighborhoods, there probably would be instant action. But because it's a pro-Gaza crowd, not much happens. I don't think anything happens. So, as I said, I'm belaboring the point because I think there really is something new and different that has come up in the 9 years of the tenure by this government. Do you think I'm putting it too strongly?
No, not at all. In fact, I would say it has a significant history going back in certainly the world of academe, of so-called grievance studies, that all see the world through this world of oppressor versus the oppressed. And now finally, this is coming into full public force and visibility now. And that's something new now. I would frankly never believe we would see the day, Nigel, as someone who's observed this and studied this for decades, really, that we would see a day where grievance studies like this would somehow have any credible following as a public policy maker. This is something new, and this is very disturbing, but it is not new in the context of totalitarian regimes in history, whether it's Maoist China, whether it's the Soviet Union. These are very important lessons to pay attention to. And again, it's the same type of methodology where there's a demonization of different parties who dare to disagree with the narrative that different persons in power wish to uphold and manipulate. And then it's the separation and ultimately the persecution in its different forms.
Do they believe their own rhetoric, or is this an entirely cynical use of the force of government in order to establish the narrative of a ruling party in a hope of just continuing it and extending its rule? Do they really actually believe this?
It's a brilliant question, Nigel. I think we all wonder this regularly, but I think it's both. I think you have parties who really do believe that Canada is irredeemably racist systematically, and that it is a country filled with, quote, white supremacists and all the rest, which of course we all know it isn't. Canada is filled with people who are unified and proud of their history. They don't believe it's perfect, but they do know that racism has no place in our country. But what we see also is the application of cynical power politics. And I think that this is a situation where you have announcements being made that appears to be credible public policy when in fact I would argue that it isn't. It's self-serving, and it's been serving towards a particular set of special interests who want to do the proxy or the bidding as third parties on behalf of the government who wishes to promote this type of narrative. Why? I think all in terms of a run-up to an election where a lot of the policies that they pursued, and I think you've alluded to this, Nigel, are not sadly working. I mean, they are destroying Canadian standard of living. Our affordability is worsening. There's a sense that our country is indeed broken. And why is that? Because we pursued policies that many, including ourselves at Frontier, have cautioned many, many times have never worked. So I think this is the time where they want to change the channel, but do in a way that reinvigorates their activist base and creates a renewed network to go after their political opponents.
Here at the Western Standard, we have actually been talking about this for a couple of years, but how is the rest of the media handling this story, to your observation?
Well, I think generally poorly. I think this is the other story, is that, it's a bit like the analogy of going into a room and seeing a large elephant and only seeing one part of it, like its tail. You have to look at the larger picture here. So it's not just this initiative, the so-called anti-racist initiative, but it's also combined with Bill C-63, the so-called online harms bill, which will create enormous power to edit and block, again, any narrative that they disagree with. But thirdly, it's in line with the initiative of funding the legacy media. We have some 2,000 outlets in this country that are given an extraordinary set of funds. You have many outlets like the Winnipeg Free Press, where approximately half their budget is received from the government. And they all have to basically climb on board with the government's narrative of diversity, equity, inclusion. And those are the fancy words that basically describe they're going to report on things the way we see it as a government. So they've lost their independence. And again, this is part of the lesson of history. We need good independent media, like the Western Standard and a number of others, to call out this, to try to pursue the truth, all for a free and democratic society.
I want to repeat your words back to you because I think the casual listener may wonder whether he just heard what he thought he heard. You said a moment ago that a Winnipeg newspaper, I think you cited the Tribune, had
actually the Free Press, ironically, the Free Press.
Right, the Winnipeg Free Press. What was the percentage of their budget that was met by government funds?
My understanding is it's almost 50%.
50% of their bills are paid by the federal government, not 50% of payroll, 50% of their bills?
Yeah, so what happens is you don't have a free press. You have essentially, and I apply this across all the media, the 2,000 outlets that receive this funding, it is akin to a Pravda, the Soviet mouthpiece that constantly came out every day carrying the message of the government. So when we see efforts we've always had the inclination of journalistic schools to be very much tilted towards a leftist perspective, the idea that socialism is the answer to all that ails us. But now we're seeing something different. We're seeing the introduction again of a kind of a cultural Marxist narrative that is really being spelled out here and put into operation. That's what they're doing.
Is there an explicit understanding between the federal government that issues these funds and the newspapers that receive them that they'll tread carefully on certain issues?
I think it's both explicit and implicit. I think it's implicit in the sense that whoever gives you money, you're going to be very much aware of why they invested that money with you. So you will, quote, self-censor. I mean, I think that's a dangerous part of our society, quite frankly, where you have a lot of efforts and tactics being employed to basically essentially get people to self-censor themselves. And the media, the legacy media receiving these funds is no different. Explicitly, we know that there is an agreement signed. I have yet to see a full agreement other than a principled statement that somehow the federal government is promoting the media in a way that supports their principles, whether it's to cover, quote, diversity, equity, inclusion, secondly, a climate crisis, and thirdly, the whole issue of their terms of reconciliation when it comes to Indigenous policy.
So then, David, if the viewer who has just been tuning in now finds it incredible that we're here talking about a federal government program that seeks to make snitches out of citizens, to turn in people who are doing perfectly normal things like running for school board, who happen to have an anti-trans narrative or some concerns about what is being taught about that in the classroom, or who enjoy a film such as Am I a Racist, or who perhaps even just don't like the way things are done, that these people will be turned in to the government and classified as haters. And it's not a surprise that you haven't read about it in the newspapers, because the newspapers, the mainstream media, are silent about it. And it's only through organizations such as our own, and there are a number of other worthy warriors in this cause, through how any of this comes out. But anybody who wanted to could go onto the Heritage Canada website, and they would find a list of organizations that are very open about it, who have received money from the government under this program, and the amounts of money that they received. And now there is an extra top-up of $273 million to generate this enormous impression that Canada is full of hateful people and only the Liberal government can save the citizen from the haters. That's kind of where we have reached in this country, and this is an entirely new thing.
I believe it is. And I think we should keep a larger strategic perspective, if I may. And that is that this type of initiative will do great harm to our society. Instead of building bridges, and it's interesting, they're going to be holding a series of national workshops across across Canada as a way to train them up on so-called best practices to identify what they believe are hate, and then learn how to report them so that they can in turn be prosecuted. And I would say it's not about prosecution then. It's really going to be about persecution. And I hope I'm sincerely wrong on this, but I doubt it. So in this context, this will do enormous damage, Nigel, to the fabric of our society. So instead of building those so-called bridges, it will actually rip apart communities as we dare to have honest debate and discussion about very important issues. Not just about science, but about all kinds of issues where there are different perspectives. And one of the strengths of our Canadian society has been a tradition where we have a tolerance for each other, even though we have different perspectives, that we can agree and disagree to build this country. And in unity, we do that effort. We have been able to build an incredibly prosperous and successful nation, and all people come from all over the world so that they can take in the so-called Canadian dream. So this initiative is very disconcerting, and I believe that it is very important that citizens become informed about this initiative. And so I congratulate you, Nigel, and certainly the whole team there at the Western Standard, because citizens need to speak up now to their MPs, their representatives, and say, this is not the Canada that we have signed on as citizens. Our tradition is one of tolerance and working together. This will very much radically undermine that, all in the name of diversity, equity, inclusion, and their perspective. This is not about inclusion. This is about excluding, ironically, our tradition of a free and democratic society.
You know, unfortunately, our experience during the COVID-19 crisis suggests that there are all too many people who are quite prepared to rat out their neighbors without being paid. Add the accelerant of government funding, and this could be extremely serious. Talk to us about Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, and how that dovetails with what we've been talking about so far.
Well, Bill C-63 perfectly is a complement, is complementary to this initiative. Why? Because Bill C-63 provides yet again the larger legal basis to pursue the silencing and the blocking of any narrative that the government disagrees with. So Bill C-63 is very much tied into this. They want to limit the discussion within the public square. So Bill C-63 is obviously very much connected to this initiative, and will be, again, it needs to be seen as part of this initiative, I believe.
I see. These, I think you used the phrase dark times a couple of times earlier. My understanding of Bill C-63 is that the government will provide funds for professional snitches, and that those people who have put things on Facebook or on Twitter and are years ago can be prosecuted for that in the future if they don't remove them, if they have the power to do that. And that it requires only an allegation from an anonymous source, and these anonymous sources will be paid to actually go to war with the people with whose opinions you don't agree. That's my understanding of, that's not the whole of Bill C-63, but I believe that that's within the legislation. Is that your understanding, David?
Yes. So essentially, you can connect the dots here. This initiative should not be seen unto itself, but rather connected to Bill C-63, where parties can anonymously complain, be able to initiate all kinds of legal actions against parties that they may not even know, but are offended by. Because their opinions that are being pursued do not fit their own narrative. And so that is redefined as hate speech. This is entirely foreign to our rule of law and precedents that already exists in this country about how we see hate speech. So this is a radical departure from our traditional Canadian law. And I actually refer to this as the introduction of Marxist law, because it's pursuing particular outcomes and judgments that change social equality. I think if you speak with a number of legal analysts on this, you can see this is one of the big grand debates, quite frankly, in our law schools between a traditional, more classical liberal perspective of the law and this type of law that emphasizes equal social outcomes. So this is a very worrisome trend. And I think what you're going to see here is when they talk about these national workshops, and ironically, the workshops will be called Building Bridges. It's not about building bridges. It's about animating and weaponizing the law against your fellow citizens and groups that you disagree with.
Do you think it'll pass?
I mean, I think that's, I think it remains to be seen. I mean, this is such an outrageous initiative and set of legislation that is entirely not in keeping with the Canadian tradition of a respect for the rule of law and freedom of speech. I'm doubtful that it will be passed, but I think the difficulty is that this government is so probably desperate to remove itself out of the doldrums of negative polls that it is possible that they will.
Then, of course, there'd be a period of time during which regulations would need to be written, and then an election, which, you know, is that the salvation here, that this government loses the election and this thing just falls on the wayside?
Indeed it is. But it is an important signal that this government is making to, again, its coalition of special interests who really want desperately to see this legislation so that they can go after with not just, you know, their own suasion, but the whole rule of law behind them. And I think this is very concerning. We need more than ever healthy debates about the issues that we face as a nation. This is one of our strengths. And for me, this is a very, this is the Rubicon. If you can refer to the, you know, the ancient river in Italy where history was made with Julius Caesar passing into the Roman region. This is the Rubicon of Canadian society now. If we can't hold the line to, paraphrase Tamara Leach and the whole reference that was made there during those protests in Ottawa a number of years ago, if we can't hold the line on this one, I believe our Canadian society will arc downward rather quickly, because we are undermining the ability to speak freely, to seek the truth. And as you know, there's many cases in history where people have not been able to come to grips with the truth. And it was a courageous small group of parties, a minority, if you will, that spoke up and dared to confront the powers that be, the king, the queen, whoever it was, and say, you are wrong. This is not what is happening here. So that is an enormous strength to protect, and that is our great tradition that has made this country what it is today.
David, on that deeply unhappy note, we are out of time, but thank you for explaining that in such detail and with such passion.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.